One of the things that came through in these discussions is that this is very place-based, right? This is a book about the Mississippi Delta, but David is emphatic that it's a book about the United States, or maybe much more than the United States, as seen in the Mississippi Delta. And as such, it's a thing that we talk about a lot in a lot of different social sciences, which is place-based research. I was wondering, Jamila, you've done and you think hard about place-based research. What can we learn that would allow us to replicate or use David's method in other places or to address somewhat different questions?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, in part because it helps us to think about a scope that is inclusive of but goes beyond the specifics of what we learn from David, and instead to think about an approach, right? And one of the things that I think is challenging about place-based research, and perhaps one of the reasons why we don't see it as much, especially in public health and political science and some of these spaces where perhaps it's most needed, um, is that it is very intensive. It requires a lot of the researcher, right? In order to do place-based research that is intensive and that is effective, you have to have a certain attachment to, knowledge of, commitment to, engagement with the place itself, right? And often that's challenging, especially if it's a place that you're not from. You have to enter into that place as an outsider, and somehow garner real knowledge and information about how it works, about the processes that explain what makes that place tick, what accounts for outcomes within that place. And there is such a deep well of information that one can get when you do that, that you can't get by just looking at big aggregate patterns. There's a place for big aggregate patterns in data. There's a place for big data and, data analytics and so on and so forth. There's a lot that we can gain from that. And then there are many blind spots. There's a lot that we absolutely cannot get from that we can only get by being on the ground in a place with people, learning about what is happening in their lives and in their community. But that is a challenging thing to do. And it implicates all of our positionality, right? So what does it look like and what does it mean? For David, a white guy with a PhD, who's a university professor, to plop down in the Mississippi Delta and learn something that is useful to us. And, it's okay to be skeptical about that. Like, this is what I want to listen to about the Mississippi Delta. Really, really, but I guess what I encourage a reader and our listeners to do is to step back from that skepticism for a moment and understand that there are advantages to any vantage point when you're doing place-based research. And there are advantages to having a vantage point that brings you really close to the place, to the experience, to the identities of the people in that place. And there's also advantages to a vantage point that isn't that, right? And beyond advantages or disadvantages, one of the things that I've learned doing this kind of research is that the most important thing is the approach that you bring to it. Whether you're truly listening to people, whether you're truly engaging a wide enough swath of people that you can learn things that you hadn't known before, whether you're allowing their stories to be the center of what it is that you're learning and conveying, whether you're able to build rapport and gain their respect by treating them with humanity, with dignity, people know that. And so even reading the book, it was clear to me that David had been able to do that, because there are things people just won't tell you without that, right? Things you simply will not learn, connections you simply will not make. And this is what's tricky about place-based research, because it's a science. There are scientific elements to it. There are best practices, but it's also an art. It's about who you are. It's about how you treat people, how you view them and understand them, and how you make them feel, whether you make them feel like they can let you in to their community and to their lives. And that makes that kind of research both immensely promising, filled with possibility, able to open up new worlds to us as researchers that we otherwise would not have access to. And it also makes it immensely challenging. And David was able to thread that needle and to really pull the promise from that kind of research. And not everyone is able to do that. So it's an incredible achievement.
And if you go through it in one of the many ways in which he wears his learning so lightly, is you can actually see a whole lot of different methods being applied very subtly, but it's far more fun to read than a textbook.
Yeah, absolutely. I would not recommend reading a textbook, but I heartily recommend reading this. You at times can get lost in the book, right? Because of that. Because David is so embedded and ensconced in the place, there's a real flow there. There's a real narrative arc. There's a real set of stories that you're getting pulled into. It's very hard to do that if you're not really engaged and connected in the place, right? But when you're able to do it, oh my gosh, it makes reading a pleasure, a joy.
Sarah, I've got a question for you since you mentioned assigning it right at the end and not just giving. What are some of the things that you could do to take the potential of this book, for example, to replace a deficit-focused approach? How would you recommend people integrate it into their teaching? To whom, sort of, what kinds of situations?
Sure. And so I'm thinking of classes that might be on health policy analysis or introductions to public health, which are meant to sort of introduce you to the many social determinants of health. I think this would be a great text to provide that foundation and exactly how the social determinants of health operate. And within the context of like a policy analysis class, I think a lot of what I do when I teach such classes and that I've heard colleagues do is try to help students appreciate the value of the statistics and the testimonial and understanding how both are important influences on policymaking. And so if you look at any particular chapter to assign it, you really see that marriage of data and story. And so I think that's what I would want students to see, how they could be doing that for the issues that they care about passionately, doing the work to collect the relevant data, the data that are specific to the jurisdiction that you're trying to speak to in a particular policy analysis or making a policy recommendation. And then highlighting stories and potential people who you might think about being the ones to testify on that topic, to speak to policymakers, sort of elevating those stories. And so I think I would use a chapter from the book in that way, and again with that showing, not telling, about the value of both data and story in influencing policy and politics. So those are two uses that come to mind for me.
Thank you, Sarah Gordon of Boston University.
The question is, would anyone else want to add different ways it could be assigned or taught, like in law classes or political science or anything else? Because I could have gone on, but it's not genuine to say I would teach it in classes I don't actually teach.
I think the only other thing I would say is I find that I draw on the prologue a lot. And the reason that I do is that he writes so well about what happened with the Mississippi Constitution and the purposeful disenfranchisement of the people of the state, and how that still matters today in terms of things like Medicaid expansion. And that even in, this last year where the state legislature was finally seriously considering Medicaid expansion, it was with work requirements, which do not represent the actual situation of the people on the ground, but rather a set of pre-existing ideas as to who they should be. And I think that all comes through in in all of its complexity in the prologue, and yet the prologue is not itself complex. And so I find that I'm telling that story repeatedly. And when you draw on a resource repeatedly, it demonstrates the strength and power of it. So.
And I think I'm just echoing Sarah here, but as a political scientist in a public health school, it solves two kinds of problems for me. One is teaching political science to people who don't seriously think they want to be a Capitol Hill intern. And making the point that even if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you.
Yeah.
And the other is a problem that will make anybody who teaches, I think, in a public health school at the undergrad or master's level groan, which is how do you teach your integrative, all of public health class in a way that doesn't make the master's students miserable? And one of the superlative things this book does is it brings together the things that interest the students in the nutrition program and the students who are interested in environmental racism and the students who are interested in payment systems for healthcare. And there's something for everybody while making the point that there is a reason we call this whole thing public health. There is a reason that we've tied disparate sources of ill health together. And David makes it so clear in a place that he emphasizes is a place where he studies much larger processes. So we hope we've persuaded you that this is not just a book to buy and to give, but also a book to learn from, to learn about how to do your research, no matter where you do it or about what you do, and a book to enhance your teaching as you try to think about ways to convey some of the problems, complexities, and potential that we see in public health, in politics, in any of the social sciences that touch on those issues. So I encourage you very strongly to get the book. It's now out in paperback as well as hardback from the University of North Carolina Press, and there's a 30% discount on the slide here. So with that, thank you for listening, and thank you very much to our presenters who took the time to do this video, as well as a panel at American Political Science Association, to celebrate David and this wonderful book that we can all learn so much from. Thank you.